so much for joining me for this e-panel on sustainability. I'm joined with a few of my favorite experts on the subject, so hopefully we can clarify some of the noise. Something that I get really frustrated with when I look both industry and beyond, a lot of the conversations on this topic are led by marketeers, sometimes unknowingly to the public. So in this conversation, we have some experts, scientists, to fragrance experts, to a brand founder to help guide us through the conversation. So with me today is Dr. Micheal Fevola. He's the Vice President of R&D at Inolex, a leading global specialty ingredient company. Previously, he was research director and fellow in global beauty R&D at Johnson & Johnson. He holds a PhD in polymer science and engineering, is the inventor on 36 US patents, co-author of 16 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and serves as the chair of Personal Care Products Council's International Nomenclature Committee. Laura Markley is an environmental engineering PhD candidate and founder of Waste Free PhD, an online platform dedicated to providing evidence-based information on sustainability. Her research focuses on the life cycle impacts of plastic, from their use in our daily lives to their eventual disposal as waste, which may make its way into various ecosystems and form microplastics. Gilbert is a fragrance evaluator and trainer who has worked in most fronts of the fragrance industry and is also an award-winning fragrance journalist. Nick has been featured throughout press internationally as expert fragrance judge for the industry-renowned Cosmopolitan Beauty Awards in 2013, is co-host of the award-winning Fume Chats podcast, and co-founder of Olfiction, a fragrance house based in the UK. Liah Yoo is an entrepreneur and content creator based in New York City. Liah is one of the top beauty influencers with more than 1 million subscribers on YouTube. She's also the she's also the founder of Crave Beauty, a skincare brand that sets out to liberate people from the stress, confusion, and a whole lot of overwhelm in skincare. And then last but not least, Dr. Mariana Royer holds a PhD in chemistry of natural substances. Her initial research focused on the role of extractives in the physical and mechanical properties of wood species from French Guiana. During a postdoctorate in Quebec, her research turned to the Canadian forest industry. In 2013, she founded Biostrategy and its first startup, BioForExtra, which developed actives from waste of Quebec sawmills, bought out in 2018 by an American multinational ingredient distributor. Via Biostrategy, Mariana acts as an expert for major players in the Canadian bioeconomy and was a partner in the Nordex project, the first industrial eco-extraction plant promoting biodiversity in the far north of Quebec. And just for some groundwork before I ask you guys the first question, just because this whole topic is about sustainability, it would probably help to define it. So the definition I'll use is based off of the Brundtland Commission, which ultimately is about doing things in a way that will be viable into the future if things continue as they are, environmentally, socially, and economically. For a more scientific way of looking at the term, I personally recommend looking to the natural step definition as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So with all of that aside, my first question: from your vantage, what are the top sustainability challenges we face in the cosmetics industry? Nick, would you like to start?
Okay, sure. So yeah, just to clarify that anytime I kind of say our industry, I'm not going to be speaking specifically to cosmetics. It's going to be more specifically about fragrance, because we do share a lot of crossover and similarities in our supply chains and the way that we source materials and ingredients. But obviously, my expertise lies in the fragrance world. So I just want to kind of go, hi, yeah, that's the thing. From our vantage point in the fragrance industry, I think the top sustainability sort of challenge or concern is biodegradability of materials. So over the years, there have been a number of materials that have kind of discovered that they accumulate in nature or they don't readily biodegrade without an additional treatment step. So you need to form like an enzyme or something to help break it down. And that's not a problem if you're thinking like fine fragrance that you're spraying on yourself because it doesn't go into the environment. But if you're thinking of something that you're using like a wash product or something that's going down the drain, then that's obviously a concern because you don't want to get those products into the ecosystem and into the water supplies. And now there has been a lot of work that's been done to like eliminate usage of the materials or find solutions to help break them down in water treatment facilities, but that's still a major concern for the fragrance part of the industry.
Liah, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So honored to be here. I feel like I'm way underqualified compared to all of these experts out there. But I think as a brand founder, what I often see in this entire skincare and the beauty industry and the CPG industry as a whole is probably hyper consumerism. I think that's one of the biggest sustainability challenges that we are all feeling and all consumers are being faced with as well. I think especially with skincare, the space has become more like a fast fashion industry, unfortunately, where we need to generate and launch new trends and to create another unnecessary demand and push the customers to think that your skin is not capable without these million different products that we're presenting to you, right? But unfortunately, like without placing a heavier focus on the reduce aspect out of the entire 3R, reduce, reuse, recycle, waste hierarchy, I think the effort for a lot of beauty brands to change their packaging and implementing a great waste reuse, recycle program will still be more of a masking the problem effort. So I think for businesses, we need to start thinking about, is our existence creating more problems or are we actually here to solve problems? And I'm convinced that like, at least for us at Create Beauty, we're playing a crucial part in the industry to throw a paradigm, start a conversation where we need to slow down in order to sustain the longevity of the business and also do good for the planet, do good for people's skin. So I think the consumerism, unfortunately, is the biggest sustainability challenge that I often do see.
Mariana, would you like to go next?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation, Jen. I'm really happy to be with you today also. Yes, for me also it's like the packaging and to create short circuit between the resource and the product and the market. And ecotoxicity also is not because sometimes you have natural active that it's really friendly for the environment. So we still facing this kind of challenge. The sourcing is very important, and the impact that you have on the society finally is important. I think yes, as Liah said, is really is still a challenge to do we mask the problem or do we act really for the future and the future industry? Yeah.
Laura, would you like to go next?
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for having me here. You guys both said great points. I agree with all of you, and especially the point of the over consumerism, I think is super important because you can change all the packaging you want, but if you're still producing a ton of packaging, like there's still going to be that impact whether it's biodegradable or not. I think part of the issue is a lot of the greenwashing in the industry where people are switching to packaging that might be biodegradable or might be, typically recyclable, but it's not actually recyclable where people live, or it's not biodegradable where they live because they don't have access to an industrial compost facility. And I think the labeling systems on all of these products can be really confusing from a consumer standpoint because, I know I study plastic pollution, so I'm aware of what some of the jargon changes are, but not everyone is going to want to dig into all of that. And I think it takes a lot of time to find the accurate information. So I think it just becomes a consumer's worst nightmare when you introduce the greenwashing aspect as well. But yeah.
And then finally, Mike, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I think I'd like just kind of to underscore a lot of your comments. I think that the technical challenges, there's a pile of technical challenges associated with sustainability, and those aren't the ones that really concern me. I think we'll get there. Science will get us there. I think the biggest problem or challenge we have is around communications, and that folds in all the things that we talk about, the consumerism, the fact that marketing in many cases is, kind of delivering a lot of the messaging and message, and from a marketing point of view, it's the ideal message is simple and convenient. And the simple fact is science is neither convenient or simple. It's very complex. And then when you try to get to a lot of these root causes and understand what is the best solution, there's a lot of unpacking that has to happen there. And it doesn't really fit easily into, sometimes a web page or a short communication. So I think overcoming the communication, I would say 95% of our industry is everything they do is well-intentioned. And I think the brands really mean well and they're really committed to their values. But it gets difficult to try to tease apart all of these things when you get into things like traceability and sourcing, end of life and the fate of things, in the environment is challenging. I personally have a great deal of the recycling guilt when I found you here. I was thinking I was doing the right thing, separating plastics, and then to find out that, well, a lot of it, despite taking those steps, doesn't get recycled. It makes you rethink a lot of things. So I think, it's just having better forms for dialogue and clear communication so that consumers can make informed choices, I think will be a very important part of overcoming or getting to a better place with sustainability.
Yeah, and I guess my challenge kind of feeds into the next question, which is around misconceptions. But I think part of the challenge is we are all, whoever you are in the industry, from brands to consumers, looking for easy solutions. So oftentimes we look to alternatives, which sometimes end up being regrettable. We rely on fallacies because it's easier. It makes sense. The world of cosmetic science is so confusing, complex. People sometimes fear what they don't understand. So I think this kind of feeds into some of the issues which actually will lead us to resolutions, or the solutions that might lead us to resolutions. And also, is there a resolution for consumerism? I don't know. But anyways, my next question is around some of the misconceptions. So from your space in the industry, what are some of the top misconceptions that you see? Mike, would you like to start this one?
Sure. I think, probably one of the biggest misconceptions is that natural, anything is going to be kind of the cure-all, because we know from a life cycle assessment point of view, that's not always the case, that there's a lot of, if you look at sourcing, the production of ingredients and the combination of those ingredients, all of the transport and the supply chain, and as well as the end of life, that a life cycle assessment can often turn up some inconvenient truths about natural. So I think, at Intellex, our approach has been to look at the entire life cycle and to try to, minimize the trade-offs, and really, if it makes sense to use a small amount of a petro-derived ingredient because you can dramatically reduce energy usage, water consumption, improve biodegradability, why wouldn't you make something that's 87% natural bio-based? There's that remaining small fraction, but it delivered so many other kind of benefits from a life cycle assessment. So I think that's the big thing to watch is natural. Biorenewable is good, but as I always tell people, there's 12 principles of green chemistry. Using renewable feedstocks is just one of them. It's number 7, but we have to remember the other 11.
Laura, would you like to go next for this one?
Sure, yeah. Those were all great points. And I think one I would add is that biodegradable is always going to biodegrade. I think that's a big one, because depending on where people test the biodegradability, it might not biodegrade in different environment. So if you think about people testing for biodegradability in industrial composting, where it's really high temperature environment, it's well aerated. If you put that same product in the marine ecosystem, so that's why a lot of plastic pollution issues arise, because even if you put a bioplastic in the marine environment, it might take a lot longer. And that's something people typically don't test for. So that's definitely a big misconception, as well as life cycle analyses often don't account for the end of life of plastic in a way that's going to reflect the formation of microplastics and plastic pollution. I think that's a big issue, and LCAs right now is trying to like add that in an informative way that kind of reflects that impact when we also don't fully understand the impact yet. So it's this kind of challenge of integrating that. But yeah, those would be my two big ones probably.
Now, Laura, before you stop talking, we had a question in the comments around biodegradability. What does biodegradability mean? And then also, what's the difference between biodegradability and degradability?
Right. So the way I understand it is degradability means that it will break down, but not into its base components, like break down fully. So if you think of a bioplastic, they can degrade into smaller pieces and they form microplastics. But then biodegradability, it will break down into its base components. So that means like carbon sources and etc. That's how I understand it, but I know there's some different definitions around what that means. There's also compostability and industrial compostability. So that adds some other layers.
Now, Mike, coming back to you from so when I think about ingredients outside of plastics, the way that I think about this term differs a little bit. Sorry, I just touched my mic. That probably, for the viewers, sorry about that. But Mike, would you mind adding to that definition from the ingredients? So for example, like sodium EDTA, is that biodegradable? Or silicones, is that biodegradable? But then also, do silicones eventually degrade? You don't have to answer those latter questions, but just for the degradability and biodegradability.
Right. So typically the way we approach biodegradability, and this is what many consumers of ingredients or finished goods houses look for, is actually a test, the OECD 301 biodegradation test. And there's other variants of that method, but basically it represents of what that biodegradation would look like if that product was released into a wastewater treatment facility, is really what it simulates. So you have organisms there that are going to feed on that material. And that's generally kind of what's considered the standard for biodegradability. There's different levels. So if something achieves a certain level of degradation in 28 days, it may be considered readily biodegradable, whereas things that may take a little bit longer are considered ultimately or inherently biodegradable. And then again, there's other things that may degrade by their mechanisms in the environment. So for example, if you have a marine release, for example, sunscreen is a great example. That's not going into a wastewater treatment plant unless someone's taking a shower, but typically it's released at a river or lake or at the ocean. And that's going to be a different degradation profile. But again, if something meets those criteria, it's reasonable to assume that it would, degrade under those environmental conditions and in the presence of organisms, UV light, water, and so forth.
And then coming back to the original question, Mariana, would you like to go next?
Yeah, the misunderstanding you mean between, yes, I think my comment would be natural versus sustainable. As I said, it's not enough to be natural. Today, you need to really think about sustainability. It's very different. And I think it's the most misunderstanding on the market. People think it's green because it's natural, and green means sustainable. It's not at all that. So because we need to think about supply chain. And as I said, from the resource to the market, if you have 20 steps, and if you have transport, and if you have packaging, etc., finally you mask the problem. So yes, I think this greenwashing is based on that, basically.
Nick, would you like to go next?
I mean, it's impossible to just not echo that, isn't it? That's the issue that we often find as well, is that people will come to us and they'll say, oh, we want a sustainable product, so we want a natural one. And then we have to kind of explain, well, actually, that's not really necessarily the case. And so there's like a lot of unpicking of that, because it's like Mike mentioned, it's people want simple answers and everything is more complex. And the simple answer is it's grey. It's not black and white in this world. So yeah, I guess the natural is the only sustainable option and synthetics are not sustainable is the main misconception that we certainly see in our part of the industry. Yeah.
And then finally, Liah, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I think the top sustainability misconception, one of the biggest one that I definitely do see is among consumers or even among businesses is putting, I guess, like portraying that packaging is the only aspect when it comes to judging a company's sustainability effort. I think it's because like product packaging is the most tangible product that consumers interact with and physically touch and feel and use on a daily basis. But I think it's easy for the industry and the consumers to evaluate one company's sustainability efforts based on the product material. But I think there's so much beyond that, as everyone has pointed, like there's ingredient sourcing, the practices that goes behind in supply chain, the sourcing, the manufacturing, the ingredient processing even, and the product design level, the energy use, the water use, the transportation, the distribution is a big one. And I think the end of life cycle of the product material, like these are all the things that will take up probably a chunk of the carbon footprint of one business operations, and viewing sustainability more holistically is something that I at least want to keep doing, using my platform that I have on my social media to invite and encourage people to view a little bit more holistically, because yes, packaging material can be a really important aspect when it comes to coming up with a sustainable solution, but it's not the end all be all. It's not going to have so much of a big significant environmental impact, because that's also not touching the systemic issues that we are facing in the CPG industry.
Now, a lot of you guys brought up the natural point. And just a question to, I guess, foreshadow a future question. I wonder if the industry eco-certifications and NGOs that amplify this messaging that natural will be better, that preferentially give better ratings to natural ingredients, that will certify products for having more natural products. I wonder if that is augmenting this view among consumers and brands. I wonder if that's a positive for the industry, but stay tuned. We'll come back to that question. This next question is related to what Liah was just talking about with misconceptions around packaging. So there's a lot of pressure, and I know you've personally dealt with this, Liah, to move away from plastic packaging, from cardboard and glass, refill to package free. From an environmental impact perspective, is this blanket thinking productive? Why or why not? Also, how do these perceptions in industry impact brands? Is it helpful or harmful in moving forward to reduce our impact? Maybe we'll just get started, since you researched this topic, started with Laura, and then we'll move to the brand perspective with Liah.
Yeah, so that's a tough one, because I think when you get to the packaging aspect, you want to kind of follow the waste hierarchy. So usually if someone asked me, like, what should I do for my brand if I want my packaging to be more sustainable? I'd say probably if people can refill it, that's probably the best, because they can reuse that and they're not just disposing of the packaging right away. But I think there's a lot of hidden aspects to that. So some people will do that and they'll have it be a local refill, which is probably the most beneficial, because then they don't have to mail it back to you. You don't have to clean it. You don't have to have this entire new system for taking care of your packaging. So I think that's a big challenge. And then potentially being able to recycle it is another one. So cosmetics packaging, because people want like that specific look and that specific branding, I think it's a big challenge, because a lot of the time they're not designed for recyclability or reusability. They're designed to look a certain way. But if you think about like certain plastics, like black plastics are very hard to recycle, almost never recycled. And then you have glass. If you have colored glass, that's not as desirable as something clear. So I think there's those challenges and misconceptions, but I think it can be beneficial to a point, but also difficult because there's no correct answer, I would say. Like obviously if you're making a plastic packaging product, that's completely like, you don't need to use that much. It's just, get rid of it. But otherwise it's not as like cut and dry, I think, as completely just saying like no plastic at all. And I think it's also important to look at how you're getting that product to the consumer. So most of the packaging that I've seen from companies personally is in how they package a product, in the shipping of the product, rather than just what is holding it. So I think that's another important aspect too.
Now, Laura, just to dig into this a little bit more, we had talked on a previous podcast. If anyone wants a whole bunch more detail, I'm looking over here at the chat, like I'm looking to the people in the audience. I should be looking at the camera. But in a previous podcast with Laura, we had talked about this topic in quite a lot of detail. So if you want more, then go listen to that podcast. But something that came up was that a lot of the times we only focus on one side of the life cycle of the product, usually the end, that when it's at waste management, when we're trying to process it, instead of looking at the front. When you look at, for example, the resource impact of glass and cardboard, which are actually higher than plastic, for recyclability ease, our systems are set up for plastic recycling, and it really depends. It all depends on where people are. The idea of refill is a great idea, I think, but it's not available to everyone. So if you're out in the country, you might not have that option. So what are brands offering those individuals? What are the accessibility situations like for your packaging? And I also have, I put up an Instagram post that I highlighted a plastic researcher based in Europe, a TED Talk that I highly recommend. But from it, they highlighted research done in Europe that looked at how much resources would we need if we just stopped using plastic? Because I think this is important to ask. So if we stopped using all plastic packaging in favor of eco alternatives, and with that we mean glass, eco alternatives, glass, paper, and aluminum, we would need 3.6 times the material, 2.2 times the energy, with an increase of 2.7 times the carbon emissions. So it's just not a cut and dry thing. Laura, would you like to add to what I've just said?
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue because, sampling in these freshwater ecosystems. So part of my PhD research is looking at microplastics in freshwater. And it's kind of mind-boggling to take a sample just over a 15-minute trawl and find, one sample had 300 microplastic particles in it. And to see that in person, it's kind of just this crazy thing. And you kind of have to almost see it to believe it, that microplastic is so widespread and that it's only going to get worse. So I think it's important to still have that perspective of where is plastic ending up. And there's a recent study too showing that the US is the greatest contributor of plastic pollution that's mismanaged into the environment. So that's another issue. But yeah, I think a talk I saw recently by Tamara Galloway, they are working on this campaign called Exemplar. And it was this really interesting perspective of looking at the regional implementation of certain changes to curb plastic pollution. And I think they had showed the life cycle impact of switching from plastic in their products to glass. And they also found that that would increase the resource usage and material usage, especially from transportation. But also they looked if they could make their glass thinner, what would that potentially change? And so not only looking at, what existing solutions do we have to shift away from the plastic problem, but how could we change either our plastic packaging to be more recyclable, more reusable, and more returnable, but also how could we potentially, if we want to move to glass, make it better, and the added impacts of thin glass just break and then you have this other whole problem. So I think there's a lot of different aspects that need to come together, and a big challenge with it is like, I think having these conversations where, people from like the brand aspect, the polymer aspect, green chemistry, plastic pollution researchers all come together to have the conversation, because right now I think there are conversations being had separately in different rooms, but really it's important that we all come together and kind of try to fix the problem together.
Perhaps this could be a topic for a future e-panel just specific to packaging. Vote yes if you'd like to see that in the chat. I think I could talk to you about this I know we talked for about 2 hours on our podcast already, and there's so much more to say. But we won't for this panel. You'll just have to go watch the podcast. But Liah, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting conversation. Like, obviously, people have good intentions to wanting to become more sustainable, and the easiest to look into is the product material that they're consuming. So naturally, the conversation about like, is glass better than plastic, or should we demonize and criminalize plastic in the first place, is becoming a hot topic. I mean, I do appreciate the intention behind the conversations, but definitely not a fan of this conversation becoming so polarized and just criminalizing one material over another without looking at the entire context. So, and I'm also not really a fan of the brands who are labeling themselves sustainable just because they use glass jars, because we clearly have a lot of U.S. counties that even don't even accept glass in their recyclable streams. So coming from Crave Beauty, our operations, because our supply chain is rather global, we manufacture our products in South Korea, we ship them back to the United States in the Jersey warehouse and California warehouse. So a huge part of our carbon footprint does come from transportation. I think it was over 60%, 70% of it, amounting to our entire business operation carbon footprint when we did the entire audit. In this case, using glass packaging can and will only increase the cost and also the greenhouse gas emission. I think the topic is definitely more systemic, as Laura and Jen, you pointed. I think it's more than what consumers and what businesses can collectively change, as it needs to rely heavily on the infrastructure or the product design level, from the green chemistry level, or designers and engineers coming all together to solve these issues and implementing like strong government policies around to solve this end of life cycle waste problem that we're being faced on a day-to-day basis. But I think, one thing that I would love every audience to know who's watching this video is that the recycling industry is also a for-profit industry as well. And sometimes they would prefer plastic over glass or glass over plastic based on what they can sell to their potential buyers. So this is not so black and white. It's not so easy to solve, but the conversation that I love seeing more of, especially in the consumer space or in the beauty brand space, is moving away from multi-material to mono-material so that people can easily recycle, the consumers can easily recycle without having to deconstruct a certain component, pulling out the metal string from the pump, just chugging that away to the recycling bin, using more recyclable plastics like PET over other plastic materials, and making sure your plastic or glass or whatever material that you chose is not too decorative or too colored so it loses its recyclability value. I think this is something that a lot of beauty brands or CPG brands really don't know, because the packaging suppliers still need to make profit. So they will have to make sure that their packaging is designable and, well branded. So it's something that all of the stakeholders in this entire industry, entire ecosystem need to collaborate in order to make a systemic impact and have a better sustainable solution altogether.
And before my next question, I'm just going to quote a researcher, Leila Karaglu, where she says, "Functionality defines environmental impact. The problem is with use and not the material. So if we're going to start living sustainably in this world, we're going to have to find smarter, more systems-based solutions to our problems. For example, closed-loop systems for production, designs for easy disassembly at the end of the life, better systems in place for recycling, longer lifespans of products, etc. We need to learn to do more with less, understanding the system, and then looking for market-driven, viable, consumer demand-oriented alternatives. This is how we can start radically changing the sustainability agenda. And I just think that this speaks so much to around what Liah was just saying there. And so my next question is for Mike, Mariana, and and Nick. Sorry, in my question I put Mike twice. I'm like, what?
I saw that in the thing, and I thought, I'm sure she means me.
So my question is, are natural ingredients inherently more environmentally friendly? Perhaps at this point this answer is obvious, but I'll ask it anyways. On the flip side, are synthetic ingredients inherently less environmentally friendly? What are some of the challenges we face here and considerations we should be thinking about when assessing the sustainability profile of ingredients? Who would like to start?
I can start if you want.
Sounds good.
Yeah, well, we already said that natural is not so systematically sustainable, and I think so. We respond to the question right away saying that, but indeed, natural could be very interesting because you can work from renewable resource, co-product from first transformation, for example, like the sawdust from sawmills or the skin of the fruit already transformed in a juice. Okay, but for that we have also to consider that it is sustainable. I think you have to consider the step of process, the number of steps of process, and also what they do before you have your co-products. So when we were using, for example, the co-products from wood, we were interested about how they were transforming the wood. Is the management of the forest was sustainable too? Because it's not enough to just say that I'm using a co-products. We have to understand the chain before us. And as you said, Liah, it is important that everybody work together because at the end, also at our own ingredient lifespan, we have to talk with packaging industrials, we have to talk with the transportation industrials, etc., etc. So everybody has to talk together. Finally, you need to create short circuit, as I said, but everybody in the same mission, the mission to work to find solution. Technical solution can be really high technology solution, but working for the same mission behind, which is to have the shortest circuit between your sourcing and your final product. So yes, so I mean, natural is not sustainable systematically because it can have a big impact on the society, on people working on the production, on the agriculture, etc., etc. So if there is not a systematic approach to facilitate the work of people harvesting, for example, etc., then it's not sustainable. So you have to take in account each step separately and work with people. We have an expertise there, an expertise there, an expertise there. And this is the great thing, I think, because we live in a global world. It's mondialization. You need to send your product over there because people want to know your product. So that's why it is important to work with each part of the industry. And this is the complexity of our industry, but also it's magic because it's innovative and you can have your perspective and work with another expert, which is own perspective. So I think what Liah said before, it's really that we need to work with people in transport to know their characteristics for glasses, for plastics, for everything. And also with people in building the biomaterial, the new innovation in eco-sustainable material. You could imagine for us, we do extraction from different co-products. Sometimes we have fibers that we don't know what to do. Maybe our fibers could be used in the packaging material at the end of the day. But we need to have this interaction completely with experts of eco-sustainable material. And at the end, also with the government, because it's also we need a politic vision about sustainability. If we don't have any politic vision and global one, I think we can work together, we can push effort, but it will still a masking effort because we need politics behind. It's very strategic to have the politics behind that. So yes, I think it's good for the industry to innovate about this and talk about this topic, but behind you need to involve politics for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Nick, would you like to go next?
I mean, Mariana's made some incredible points, like really, really. A lot of what I wanted to say was already in there. So thank you. The thing is, the answer is, like, the short answer is that are natural ingredients more environmentally friendly? Are synthetics less? The short answer is no. Because the sort of CO2 production of transporting the goods around, like the raw material before they're even processed, all of that kind of thing. For example, a lot of spice materials are shipped halfway around the planet to France to be processed. Well, wouldn't it make more sense to do it locally and then send smaller quantities, because that would be just less impactful just to start with. And that seems like a really small thing. They can set up a production plant there, they can just sort that out, and we don't have to then worry about shipping masses of physical stuff. You reduce the amount, therefore you reduce the amount of CO2 you're producing or generating through that process, just in a very simple transportation step. And in terms of kind of like environmentally friendly, well, that's such a broad thing. A lot of what happens with intensive farming of ingredients degrades soil, because there's not proper management of the production, there's not proper management of the agriculture, and the demand quite often outstrips the supply. So, for example, there is not enough vetiver oil produced in the world for every fragrance that wants it. There's not enough patchouli oil produced in the world for every product that needs the patchouli oil. And these things go on and on and on. And because of that, the farmers and the producers are kind of driven to have to over ask from their land and get more out of it than they really can. So that degrades the soil. Then there's not work necessarily being done to help regenerate that. So that is kind of like another step that needs to kind of be thought about. And then there's the whole carbon life cycle of, well, if we're producing plastics, for example, and then we're getting side stream products from the oil industry, petrochem industry, and then converting those, that might be a lot more sustainable than, say, growing a whole ton of plantain grass and extracting the cis-3-hexanol from that, for example. So we end up in these positions where we need to kind of look more intensely at what is being done at the processes, at how much CO2 is being produced at different points, and all kinds of stuff. Like the whole cycle of creating the material to start with is really key in like getting that understanding, getting that knowledge of what's best. How do we then blend these practices together? That, I think, is really an important part of how to move forward with the sustainability, and also to consider the sustainability of our materials. And it's very early stages for the fragrance industry. We've not really looked at the life cycle of a lot of our synthetic ingredients versus the natural. So that's kind of happening now, is a discussion that's happening now, and it's moving, and there's research being done, but it's still early stages for us.
Mm-hmm. Now, just to add in a few points before I give the mic to Mike. So I just have a few thoughts that I would love, especially you, Mike, to chime in. I'm sorry for ambushing you. So the few thoughts. So most research now around sustainable agriculture is showing that we need to figure out how to produce more with less, especially over the next 30 years. By 2050, we have a growing population, and our demands, regardless of the waste, managing the waste from food waste, we have to grow more. That's just a reality. And if you want more on this topic, I had a whole panel on sustainable agriculture with Dr. Kevin Folta and Dr. Rennie Van Acker that I highly recommend watching or listening. I also publish it as a podcast. So, I mean, then does it make sense for us to be producing ingredients for the sole purpose of producing ingredients? For example, extracting all these tropical ingredients directly from nature and its only uses in cosmetics versus using maybe byproducts from industry. So we're not adding to the land usage from agriculture. We know that agriculture, for all the things that we do, its expansion, particularly into intact ecosystems, is the largest driver for biodiversity loss and the significant impact for carbon emissions. So just thinking about this and thinking about some of the messaging, which if people follow me know that this is something that I get quite frustrated with, but where does this leave natural ingredients? And then on the flip side, when we think about the demonized petroleum-derived ingredients. So petroleum-derived ingredients are derived from byproducts of petroleum sourcing. So what is the impact when we actually look at today's usage of these ingredients compared to some of these natural ingredients? And obviously it's a case-by-case basis. Is this byproducts from industry, or is it something that is directly sourced just for the sole purpose?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mike.
It's really interesting.
But obviously we want to move away from petroleum sourcing. Of course we do. But right now, the world relies on petroleum sourcing because it fuels the world. So it doesn't make sense, as we're moving away from petroleum but still using it, not to take advantage of the waste from that industry. I'll stop talking and give the mic to Mike.
No, Jen, I think you raise a fantastic point. I mean, the petrochemical industry, it's had decades to achieve economies of scale and efficiencies that are unseen with naturals. And if you put it on, on paper from like a thermodynamics or a mass balance point of view, nothing goes to waste in that industry. Virtually everything is consumed and used. And that could also probably be said for a lot of agricultural, things, but there's still a lot of waste biomass that unfortunately can't be put to good use. I mean, we're always trying to make use of everything, especially when there's an economic incentive to do that. And we've been successful in many cases. But, I think the petrochemical industry has also been their own worst enemy over the years. I mean, they kind of shoot themselves in the foot when, there's spills, there's, methane release from, fracking, water contamination. I mean, these are preventable things that they just, have not controlled adequately. And it's made for very bad press around what otherwise, we owe our standard of living today to the petrochemical industry. There's no doubt about that. So I think things need to be done right. I think most people approach things with good intention, but it's looking at all the systematic thinking around, okay, what is a better choice here? So for an example of, kind of doing naturals in a way that looks to integrate well in a life cycle scenario. I mean, if you could look at what we've done, we have a product called Pro Condition 22, which is a hair conditioning ingredient. And the base feedstock for that is rapeseed oil, high erucic acid rapeseed oil. It's grown either in North America or in Eastern Europe. So it's kind of closer to the areas of where the final ingredient will be produced than palm. That we actually make that ingredient right off of the oil by reacting it with a small molecule amine. So there's not this step of fatty acid splitting. So we're taking out steps as we try to make this molecule. The other piece is that if you look into a crop rotation, many times this crop is planted as a cover crop. It's not competing with food. It's planted in the off season so that it can be tilled back into the earth after the seed is harvested and kind of serve to fertilize the next crop that's coming along. It doesn't require pesticide usage. It actually grows so densely that it doesn't require herbicides either, because it just kind of creates its own cover for itself. So we try to look at, say, okay, that's a very beneficial feedstock if we compare it to palm, let's say, which has to be transported from much farther. There's a whole other, litany of issues with palm that everyone's aware of. So I think trying to diversify feedstocks where it makes sense. Use judiciously petro-derived ingredients to help maximize, as I said earlier, there's a cost-benefit analysis that goes into everything, and there's a great deal of cost that can be saved in terms of energy usage, carbon footprint and waste production by using judicious amounts of petro-based feedstocks.
Mhm.
I'm just looking for just so that I have some points, because you brought up points from a post that I put up. I had some statistics around palm that I would love. I'm sorry to continue to harass you on this panel, Mike. Around the fact that when you compare for oil seeds produced, the efficiency of palm compared to other oil seeds, it is significantly more efficient than the other seeds. And I have a post with specific relations to the next closest, but it is like heads in whatever the colloquialism, I don't know why I always try. It's way more efficient. Okay, so let me, with respect to land usage for producing the material, with respect to water usage, obviously there are immense challenges with transportation and then also with the social responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a number of conversations with people who are doing work with palm, and from their vantage, that if we were to move away from palm as a society, well, so many people would have employment insecurity, just insecurity in general with their life. So does it make sense for us to move away from such a efficient crop, or should we invest in the crop? Does the cosmetics industry, since we're not the main user of palm, to my understanding, we were using more waste or byproducts of the industry, but perhaps I'm wrong there. But when I look at other industries, to how the cosmetics industry invests to do things better, should we be moving away as the industry that is investing so much to produce palm more sustainably, or should we be investing in using such a efficient crop? I don't know if there's a right answer to this, but perhaps you'd like to chime in.
I mean, I think the emphasis should be on diversification. You have to kind of pick the solution that fits best to kind of reduce impact. Mm-hmm. So I think in many cases, palm is a fantastic, ingredient or starting material, provided it's sourced sustainably, that you're committed to ensuring that the supply chain doesn't, kind of have any of those environmental or societal costs associated with it. I think it fits into a portfolio of diverse feedstocks. I mean, I think there's other, again, performance. I mean, palm is, the palm itself is for the C16 and C18 fraction that's used typically more in hair conditioning applications or emollients and emulsifiers, whereas the palm kernel is used to get the C12s and C14s that are more for the surfactants used, in shampoos and things. So I think, understanding, well, okay, what are my alternatives? And, if I look at, in a given application, for example, I cited the, rapeseed oil for the longer chains. Actually, from rapeseed oil, you get C18s and C22s. So you actually get longer carbon chains that give you more enhanced conditioning, more efficient usage. So you use less product. So I think it's there's never a simple answer there. I don't think we walk away from palm. And as you mentioned, the cosmetics industry is a small, consumer of most of the palm. The majority of it's going into food. And again, we're always, as a society, that's priority number one, is making sure we keep our people fed around the world. So we don't want to undercut that either.
Mm-hmm. Then maybe just to complete, when you talk about intensive agriculture, and yes, I understand your point. And in some cases, that's why it's important to think case by case and work on your supply chain where you are. When we work in Quebec, for example, it's different today how we work in French Guiana. French Guiana, it's the only French Amazonian country, let's say that. And basically, the agriculture is not enough developed. And they need to find a new perspective of application for ingredients coming from these resources to help producers to produce more and have more alternatives for the market. So sometimes we work directly from the fruits produced by agriculture because we want to help them to have new volume perspective and new applications. So for us, it's sustainable in this case. Even if we compete a little bit with food, it's not enough it's more winner for them because they have a new market perspective and they can really invest in their land. So it really depends where you are and how an impact is impacting people, basically.
And so if anyone wants more details around the topic of agriculture, we're not going to have that much time to talk about it, but I had a whole panel focused to this topic. So I highly recommend, again, going and watching that panel. I had a question in the comments asking about good resources to learn more about the sustainability and what that all means. I would highly recommend checking out the Sustainable Development Goals. Just Google that and you'll find a lot of information. And I also quite like Natural Step. There is a lot of information from them at looking at the term in a bit more of a scientific way. And my next question is to both Mike and Laura. So there's a lot of noise around microplastics in cosmetics. What should we know? What are some misconceptions on the topic? And what's the current regulatory situation like? Laura, would you like to go first?
Sure, yeah. So as far as regulation, I know in 2015 there was the Microbeads, I can't quite remember the name, Microbeads something act, but that regulated microbeads and rinse off cosmetics. So I don't know if there's the potential for getting around that somehow in other products that could end up in the environment. I know outside of cosmetics, detergents still can have microbeads. And I guess that's some of the misconception is that all microbeads are now removed from products, but they can still exist in other products. So I think it's there's been some interesting research in how you can replace with other exfoliants. And it's interesting because some of the like natural replacements that places like I think Procter & Gamble have tested actually don't biodegrade super readily. So I think it's interesting that like people always want to switch like a natural exfoliant or some sort, but some of those aren't fully biodegradable within a reasonable time period. So it's that added bonus of is there another impact from, you know, introducing this natural but still not going to biodegrade product into the system in like mass quantities. And I know that studies looking at freshwater, I myself have found it in samples. Microbeads turn up in freshwater samples. They've turned up in Great Lakes studies. And they're very hard to track back to their source. So if I see a microbead, I don't really know where that came from, aside from potentially looking at the location of the microbead and potential inputs into that freshwater system. But it's really hard to link them back to their source.
Mike, would you like to add to that?
I agree on the tracking to source is a big challenge here, because that's really, if you're looking to eliminate, any type of pollution, understanding the root cause is a big issue. I think the Microbead Free Waters Act, it clearly eliminated one prominent source, but I think it didn't go, if anything, it didn't go far enough because it targeted cosmetics, but it ignored things like abrasives used in sandblasting applications. So for example, there is a great potential for direct environmental release that was, the focus was entirely on cosmetics. And in most cases, most, wastewater that would have that would go through some type of municipal treatment plant. But again, it definitely eliminated one point source. And I think our industry responded well to come up with alternative, things like plant-based waxes or, waste biomass, walnut shells, things like that, cornmeal that can be used in its place. I think microplastics also, now we're seeing a broader regulatory approach in Europe. ECHA has proposed microplastics regulations that go farther. I think they go after all intentionally added microplastics. One of the things about microplastics that's important is it's a generic term, right? There needs to be technical definition to articulate what exactly that is. So the ECHA definition does take into account things like particle size, whether or not the particle is degradable or biodegradable. I think for me as a polymer scientist, my biggest fear and concern has been misperception by the public and misuse of the words polymer and plastic, because while all plastics are polymers, not all polymers are plastics, and it creates a very scary scenario where people, begin to speak about banning polymers in cosmetics or banning polymers in anything for that matter, because that just it's not tenable. It's not a solution. So I think having clear guardrails and language, and again, an understanding of, well, what will the measurable impact be? I think with any type of regulation, we'd like to be able to see cause and effect. I think my favorite example is thinking about acid rain and coal-fired power plants. Before they were required to add scrubbing capability to their smokestacks and they were burning coal, and burning coal is a whole other set of issues in itself. But if you think about sulfurous gas emissions, once those power plants were required by law to put in scrubbing technology, we could actually see a measurable improvement in lake health because of the reduction in acid rain. So anytime I think a mitigation strategy is employed, I think we have to hold ourselves accountable to be able to test it and measure an effect. And if it's not having an effect, then we have to go back and say, okay, was that regulation effective, or are we still missing a point source that we have to identify and understand how to mitigate?
My last question, just directed to you, Mike. I'm so sorry for, again, just harassing you on this panel. And now this is related to what Mariana brought up about the politics helping us solve some of these issues, or at least try to. So the question is around, what is the current regulatory situation like with respect to sustainability in industry? Are companies held accountable for pollution? Are ingredients and packaging effectively regulated? Also, are regulations are always formed in line with a body of evidence? And I've had a number of conversations with scientists who have worked directly with some of these new bills that have come into place. So I'm thinking just a few examples that are relevant over the last few years. The New York bill with respect to 1,4-dioxane, when we know that the current limits or the current levels in the waterway in that area isn't from current usage, but rather historical usage. And from the conversation that I had with Nicholas Georges, if anyone wants a whole bunch more on that specific point, go listen to the podcast. The levels used in cosmetics currently are demonstrably safe, and there might also be a sustainability challenge from the reduction of PEG ingredients that might have 1,4-dioxane in it. So with some of the water savings we've achieved with those surfactants. So is that a good thing for our industry? The other one would be around some of the sunscreen filter bans related to coral bleaching, when the body of evidence, based on what I've seen, doesn't support the actual impacts of these ingredients into nature. And so where does that leave us with safety for filters, especially in the United States, when we're so, North America in general, when we're so already limited with the filters that we could use? And so where does that leave us with the sunscreens that we can produce when the body of evidence is showing something perhaps different? And then we look at the California Toxic Free Act. And I mean, it's great that we're coming in line with the EU, but a lot of the ingredients that were banned weren't used anyways in cosmetics. I'm sorry, I'm kind of on a soapbox with these questions. But what I've seen, and where I do kind of like it, but the confusion that it has caused for consumers, because now consumers are like, oh my gosh, we've banned all these toxic ingredients. This is such a win. Products weren't safe, and now California products are safer, when that's not actually the reality. And it's really unfortunate that that kind of messaging has been communicated by a specific NGO and a few brands affiliated with the act. Are regulations always formed in science? And does some of this, where I see misinformation being such a challenge, impact regulations, because certain NGOs are pushing politicians to do something that might not actually be aligned with reality? Mike, what do you think?
I would say, look, I mean, history is going to judge what we do from a regulations point of view, right? I mean, we may sit back here, 30 years from now and say, well, what was the measurable impact? We'll be able to measure the economic impact for sure, but how many lives were improved on the basis of some of these regulations that were passed? I think the other thing to always remember is, this concept of externalities. So if consumers are either unable or unwilling to pay for the products now that, because of the way they need to be manufactured under certain regulations, is there going to be an externalization effect? Well, manufacturers say, okay, well, instead of sourcing this ingredient because it's going to cost me so much to have it produced domestically, I'm going to source it from China or India or somewhere else where maybe they can meet the specification that's required for manufacturing in the US, but what are they doing to get their costs down? What are the other environmental impacts? And at the end of the day, the atmosphere and the oceans, they're global. So essentially we're just pushing, we may be with some of these regulations pushing some things externally in order to make things still affordable for consumers. So I think, we'll be judged by history. But again, I think if we start to see UV filter bans, the American Academy of Dermatology is going to continue to monitor skin cancer rates, and we'll see what the outcomes look like in the US. We'll be able to see probably correlation if we continue to lose UV filters. There could be a correlation there that we see down the road. And then by that time, it'll be too late for all those people who are affected.
Isn't skin cancer rates for the population already significantly higher in the United States compared to other populations? Per capita?
I believe it is, yeah. Now again, how much of that, I believe some of that also might, be with, increased level of screening as well, so.
Yeah. And so my next question is directed at whoever feels like answering this question. You don't have to answer it, but I would love to hear your answers. And so this is coming back to a point around eco-certifications and NGOs that I kind of touched on earlier. So are eco-certifications and public NGO actions driving us to do better, or are they limiting progress? What do you think? A controversial question, sorry.
I'll start by saying it's already really hard in the fragrance industry to achieve what they're asking for in a lot of those certifications. Because of the nature of the oils being produced by several farms, by small producers and so on, they can't go through like organic certification to say that their natural oils are organic even when they would be. And then the other issue is that things like EcoCert are saying, well, it has to be natural in order for us to kind of certify it. Okay, well, that doesn't mean it's sustainable. So how does that really help? I don't think it does. The problem is people want to see a logo that says this is good and this is safe. And they want to associate those things. And the reality, as always, is the issue is with us communicating that actually it's probably fine, even if it doesn't have that certification on it, because it's a gray area anyway, all of this. And what a lot of people want to hear is what I already believe to be true is true. Sadly, a lot of things that people believe to be true or want to be true aren't. So I don't think any of those eco certifications really help us. In fact, they're kind of like impossible to get for us as the sort of like fragrance side of the industry.
Who else wants?
I'd love to. Oh, sorry. I was just going to add, I totally agree about the certifications, especially on packaging. It's super confusing when there's like 10 different ways to use the recycling symbol. And so people look at like the resin identification code for plastics and assume that's this is recyclable symbol. And then there's also the ones that they use to depict that it's made from post-consumer recycled plastic. And then there's another one for it's compostable. There's another one for it's biodegradable. There's another one for Biodegradable Product Institute certification. So it just gets so confusing. And I think like people want to see the green symbol because the green symbol is God, but it's also just like so confusing from the consumer standpoint, I think.
Yes, I think it's these eco certifications. It's the first part of the, for me, it's like a first part of the good solution of the effort that we have to do, like with government and politics, etc., to work together on our industry and our processes and our chain. But basically now it is used for marketing, because consumers are reassured to see that green mark finally on the packaging. So why not? But we need to go further, to go deeper in the question, basically, because yes, it can be limiting when you not enter in their box. If you are not in their box and you're still so sustainable and so natural, etc., you cannot be recognized really, and then you cannot have this green mark. So yes, it can be limiting, but I think it's pushing the innovation. It's pushing the research. It's pushing also the techniques and the new technologies, the green technologies. So it's a part of the solution, but we need to be more realistic. And yes, don't use that like a mask again. Don't use that like a just marketing point and okay, I check the box of the system. Push also the system. The industry has also to push the politics and the system to rethink this type of eco certification, to give the transparency to the consumer. So I think it's, for now, I have the impression that it's still a box that they design and they're not working on it. So we still to work on it, to work on this box and how we can really fit our reality in the industry.
Yeah, Mariana, fantastic point. And just to go a little farther on the innovation. And by the way, Nick, I loved your comment, made me laugh. So thank you. That was fantastic. You hit it right on the head on this one. But on innovation, I think to your point, Mariana, there needs to be incentive to drive introduction of new and improved technologies. And I think one of the challenges I see with one of the most popular certifications are there's exception lists of things that, okay, there isn't a solution today, so we have a list of exceptions that may be not natural or petro-based. Well, a lot of these certifications in their policies, they don't have a sunset provision on any of these exceptions. So unfortunately, what it does is it creates a status quo bias where, because there's no incentive, there's no alternative today, people keep using the traditional technology that was allowed by exception. But further, if you do come with a new technology that could potentially be an improvement, there's questions around, well, is it, what's the cost? Is it comparable to the cost of what's on the list today? Well, of course, if it's a newer technology, if it's more innovative, then it's going to probably come a little bit of a premium. But isn't that the idea, that we have to force adoption to grow the economies of scale to then achieve the same cost of what was on the exception list? I think the other piece that can be disheartening is if someone comes with a new and innovative technology that happens to be patented, because that's one of the incentives to innovate, is to have a patented technology to enjoy the return on it. Does that get not brought on board early enough, because the argument is made, well, it's only available from one company. So I think there needs to be some incentives to drive the innovation that's going to kind of make those certifications leaders of leading, and not just kind of living in the past around kind of status quo technologies.
And this topic has come up quite a few times around certifications and their limitations, and also NGO messaging, where I mentioned at the beginning, there's a preference for natural and especially organic, which we know may or may not be more sustainable. And there are significant challenges with organic certifications for cornering farmers and limiting the choices that they can make. And then the other thing is they won't allow genetically engineered, depending on the certification, depending on the genetic GMO, but that might not be allowed. despite the fact that some of these materials might actually have substantiation to be more eco-friendly. And I bring this example up quite a bit. I am a fan of them, Genomatica producing butylene glycol, where they have a biocatalyst that is genetically engineered, not in the end product, but with the use of that biocatalyst, they were able to reduce their carbon footprint by around 50% compared to the butylene glycol on the market. Yet they weren't able to get EcoCert. Maybe that's changed. Maybe EcoCert is adopting, or I guess adapting with the science. But we know that genetic engineering can be a really positive thing for helping us drive sustainability. Yet why are these certifications telling us that they're not a good thing? When I go and look at all of these eco standards, now most of them are around clean, but clean usually encompasses also sustainability, which you can see if you actually go and read their messaging. Clean at Sephora, the EWG, if you go and look at their database, you can see that they, instead of actually looking at science, they're going and just cherry picking science to meet their agenda. I just think that this is really important because right now, a lot of the conversation on this topic, I get so frustrated when I see this at scientific conferences. To me, that's unacceptable because we are scientists. We should know better. We should be looking at the body of evidence, not just looking at this marketing messaging that's not necessarily driven by relevant scientists. So I put this statement around clean beauty, but I would also say it also includes green beauty at current with the way that it's communicated to the public via these eco certifications and the NGOs. And my statement is, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe you disagree with me, but I said that clean beauty and green beauty trains people not to trust science, encourages conspiratorial thinking around regulations, and it betrays trust across the industry. It also distracts from legitimate issues and prevents progress that can actually make products safer and more sustainable. Would anyone like to chime in on what I've just said? Maybe you disagree with me or agree with me. What do you think? If you don't want to answer, no pressure.
I mean, I broadly agree with what you said. I don't think I've got anything to add.
If everyone just doesn't have anything to add, I could just move on to my next my next question. Okay, so my next question. So I have two more questions for you. There are some questions in the comments, so we'll try our best to answer them before we have 13 more minutes before this panel closes. Time flies. Thank you again for being a part of this panel. So my second last question. What are green innovations that you're excited about in the cosmetic space, and how can brands and consumers support these kinds of innovations? Whoever wants to start.
Can I? You were talking about kind of biotech and gene editing and GMOs and so on, and that to me is a super exciting thing that's happening in our part of the industry, because there's a lot of supply issues with things like patchouli that I mentioned earlier. There's not enough supply to meet the demand. But Firmenich, one of the big companies, created or genetically modified a yeast so that they could ferment sugar and produce a material that has exactly the same CAS number as patchouli, which is called clearwood. So it's got much of the same odor profile and so on. Now, there's some stuff that's obviously missing in the odor profile from the way that it's processed and so on, but it's basically along the same lines. And if we can achieve this, then without relying on quite as much sort of like intensity and so on with the farming, then I think that's a really, really cool innovation that we should get behind. And I think that brands specifically can ask for using materials that are formed from biotech, from renewables, where that's the best option, and aiming for things to be sustainable. Consumers then need to shop with the brands that are asking the big suppliers to do that, because that's the way that we sort of support that chain. I think consumers can ask the questions, but ultimately, a lot of the time they're going to get a kind of small answer from a brand that's like, oh yeah, well, we try and be sustainable. And that's kind of it, because that's as much as a brand can do. I mean, we see a lot of people that really, really want to push it forward, but then the more that they investigate, the more they realize it's the gray area anyway, and then they end up with a kind of like, oh, well, it seems like the industry is already somewhat sustainable. It's not like you're farming like you're not digging up oil, you're not getting oil just for the sake of our industry. It's like a side product, and so it's grey. It's confusing. But I think the best thing that brands can do is tell perfumers, tell their suppliers to work with renewable materials, those biotech ingredients, and so on. And whilst the palette is still small, because it's early days in terms of innovation in that, like it's much easier to do woody things than it is to do florals at the moment with renewable materials and so on. It's the more that it's asked for, the more the science will follow, and we'll try and find a way to produce materials in this way that is sustainable and that is using feedstocks from other industries, so they might have been waste products somewhere else or so on. So I think the more that we ask, the more that we drive that demand, the more it has to follow.
From the ingredient perspective and working with the brand a lot, we love work with the brand since the beginning of the story. I mean, for now, we decide to work from the sourcing, to study the sourcing and to study the impact on the society of the agriculture. It is coming from a first transformation chain. What is the co-product? What are the perspective of the volume, etc. We work still the beginning right now with the brand, and they pushing us as we pushing them to work on a new technology to valorize the new sustainable chain. Because if you want to be sustainable, we have to study all the steps for sure. So we decide in our side to work directly with the brand on these questions and to be very together thinking about how we can keep it sustainable until the end. So it's very interesting because yes, it's promoting new technology, biotech, bioengineering, life cycle studying, and improvement, optimization of different known process, but that can be optimized to be better and to be more sustainable, and also to be more performant, because we reach both economic indicators and also sustainability indicators. So it's very interesting, and in pushing the applied research and the bioengineering. Yeah.
I can go. I think from a product developer standpoint, there's a lot of great, exciting innovations that I love seeing, which is just challenging the status quo of the product usage and the product delivery standpoint. I think there's a mounting evidence where a large proportion of the environmental footprint of rinse-off and wash-up products can occur during the use phase. So innovative products are being developed that require less water during use, such as concentrated shampoo formulas or 2-in-1 products. And now we started seeing the dehydrated toothpaste bites, which I think it's a brilliant idea of trying to solve an environmental problem in a very different way, using the green engineering principles. So I think those are the area that I definitely love seeing more.
I can't hear you.
Oh, did you want me to go? I can't remember the original question.
It's this one.
The green innovation that you're excited about the most.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I've been reading about recently is chemical recycling of plastic products. So I'd say that's one I'm interested in. There's been a lot of controversy, I think, around like if that's ever going to work. So that's instead of doing mechanical recycling, which is like grinding up the plastic, it's actually getting the plastic back into the chemicals it was made from, so that you can use those feedstocks again to like make a new product or, you know, a different polymer with those. So I think that's very interesting, and I hope to see that go in an economically feasible route. But I think, yeah, more work needs to be done on that, despite people's objections to some of it.
Hopefully you can hear me now. My the battery in my mic died. Sorry. Mike, would you like to go?
Yeah, sure. No, I think, kind of following on Liah's comments about, reimagining products and product forms, and especially to get the water out, because we spoke a lot about packaging, and part of the reason why we have to be so packaging intensive is because we have formulas that contain a great deal of water in them, especially in the cleansing, shampoo, body wash category. So I think things to kind of reimagine solid forms. I know our team at Intellex, our applications team, has done a fantastic job with their Rethink Sustainability initiative, where they have different solid formats that go beyond just a bar format and go to some different interesting forms. I think one that really caught my attention was by Procter & Gamble. They've launched two brands. One is called EC30. The other is called GEMS, GEMZ. And these are just, I think they're really cool, because what they've done is they've taken what would have otherwise been liquid formulas and reimagined them as non-woven fibrous pads that hydrate instantly when they touch water. So it is, to me, just truly remarkable to be able to deliver the experience of a liquid product in that type of solid form. And it can be done with minimal packaging. There's no water to be shipped. I think these are really, they're primed for e-commerce. To be able to ship with, just about anywhere without the added cost of shipping water around. So I think that's really cool. And I think people are going to continue to get really inventive with how do we create formats that give people a great experience, but without having to ship water around. So.
And then my final question is to all of you guys. Do you have any top recommendations to consumers and industry to be more sustainable? Liah, would you like to start this one off?
For sure. I think for customers to become a little bit more critical and have a more unbiased view towards sustainability, as we mentioned, life cycle over just focusing on one aspect of the entire product, the product really does matter more. Also, I think for brands and for companies, I really love the point that Mike has brought up in the initial conversation, where the communication matters so much. And it can really, really impact the way the customers think about sustainability and how the customers use and recycle the products. And I think as a community-driven brand like ourselves, we want to focus on encouraging people to press reset on the conventions in sustainability. And we can prioritize education, communication, creating more dialogues to view the topic holistically by giving the facts and the learnings and what we have found and what we have learned throughout the entire sustainability journey without having to make a decision for themselves. So we don't want to call ourselves like, okay, from now on, we're going to call ourselves sustainable. I think sustainability is such a broad topic with having a really multiple different, like million different definitions of what it means to be sustainable. I think the best that we can do is to give all the facts, give all the evidence that support whatever claim that we do make to the consumers, so that the consumers can make the most mindful and the most intentional and the most hopefully sustainable decisions themselves. So I think communication matters so much.
Nick, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to echo what Liah just said. Communication is key. We need to get information to consumers in a way that they can understand, in a way that is nuanced, and in a way that kind of takes into account everything that we try and express and try and achieve with sustainability. For consumers, I think keep asking your brands to be sustainable and see how they can improve what they're already doing. Don't get hung up on naturalness. Yes, natural ingredients and extracts are beautiful, they're important, they're wonderful, they have great effects even in certain cosmetics. In fragrance, we certainly rely on them because of their complexity and beauty, but they've never been the be all and end all, and that is absolutely not something you need to worry about. As like 100% natural isn't the be all and end all. Don't worry about it too much. Don't get hung up on that. And for the industry, I think it's about investing in growers and producers and helping to localize things. Because the more localization that happens, the more production that happens locally, the smaller our larger CO2 impact from transportation, from everything. And also really invest in your R&D chemists, because the R&D chemists that I've spoken to in the fragrance industry, they're working with the green chemistry principles anyway. Like, that's kind of how the industry works and has been driven forward for a long time. But they're such incredible people. And if you give them the finance and the opportunity to actually do the research and create these things and retro engineer some of the stuff that we've already got in our palette, then they'll find a way to make it even more sustainable than it already is.
Mariana, would you like to go next?
Yes, I think it's really complete already, but yes, in fact, we really want to have an impact locally first, on people, on the environment, on the forest around us. And I think if you are engaged in that good intentions, you will find the good chemist to be innovative, and you will know how to talk to your people, to your consumers. And your consumers with transparency, authenticity. Yes, you are not perfect, but you're trying. You are trying every day in research, with science, with experts. When you don't know, you're asking for new expertise around you, and you listen to nature. I'm a passionate of natural ingredients, so I believe natural can really play a big role in sustainability, for sure. I'm totally agree with that. But we need to observe more the nature, how the nature, the technologies of the nature is working, to be inspired, bio-inspired, and try to put our science in service of the nature to be sure we are sustainable. And really pass this message to the customers. They will understand because it will touch their heart. We are all connected with the nature, and we want a better world. So I think if you are transparent, you are not perfect. You can say we tried. We are not 100%, but we try ourselves to understand how to improve. We are trying to push the governments to regulations and everything to be better, but to give you also secure products, because we want to give you a secure product, a safe product before, and a product of quality. So for sure, you do compromise. So your customers have to understand that. The compromise you do to be better every day, all day. Yeah.
Laura, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so there's so many things, but I think, and so many have been said already that are just great. You guys are awesome. But I think one big one from the consumer standpoint is I've seen a lot of people that take on a lot of guilt around environmental sustainability as a consumer. And I would say to just try not to do that, because a lot of it is beyond your control. Like, some of these products, I gotta say, they're really expensive. They sometimes aren't performing as well as you would hope with some products. And so I would say that from the industry standpoint, that should be like a priority, to get that same product performance from ingredients that are more sustainably sourced, and also to be so transparent that people don't have to ask as many questions as they are or have to. Because I know when I go to a website and it just says, oh, we make sustainable ingredients. And then it's like, what does sustainable mean to you? Like, what is your goal? You know, where are these ingredients coming from? And if they have packaging, I'm curious, like, what are you using? What type of plastic is it? I think it's a lot of good questions to ask. And I wish that more industry professionals were more, I guess, upfront about some of that stuff. And even if you don't know the answer, I think that's also important. Say, you know, we're working toward understanding this more, I think is a totally fine way to do it. I say that all the time in my own field. So yeah, I think being open to being wrong is a good thing. And also as a consumer, shifting some of the blame where it needs to be, but also, you know, trying to steer clear of greenwashing where you can.
And then finally, Mike.
Oh, so many good comments. I have a tough time kind of coming up with a closing one, but I think, you know, to Mariana's point, I think we have to acknowledge, and again, as scientists, I think we're in a better position to acknowledge that we're going to try things. They're not always going to work, but that's how we learn. And we need to take the long view on sustainability. We're going to try some things that are going to be well-intentioned. And if we're conscious and we try to measure the output, you know, we make a change, what is the effect? And if it moves us in the right direction, then I think we continue with that. If it doesn't, then we have to say, well, okay, well, maybe we need to rethink, you know, this change or this regulation or this material, could be anything. But I think if we use as our guiding principle, you know, something I picked up, you know, from all my years in the outdoors is leave it better than you found it. You know, if you can just make incremental changes, those add up in the long term. And if you know, you're kind of saying, hey, I can do something a little bit more with, you know, save energy here, or improve biodegradability here, or create a new form and introduce people to it. I think all of those things incrementally will have a significant impact in the long run. So I think don't get discouraged. Take the long view on sustainability, because we're never going to solve it, right? Thermodynamics prevents us from solving sustainability. It's an unsolvable problem. So we always have to just be trying to minimize, you know, the trade-offs and kind of go for the ultimate greater good. And I think we'll get there. It's just don't get discouraged and keep going.
So we've now talked for an hour and a half. So we don't really have that much time to answer questions, but we just had one question that I'll just quickly answer because I think we're all in agreement from Jolly. Do you believe the future in the beauty industry is around sustainability? I do. I think by default, we all have to be working to be more sustainable. And to maybe chime in on some of the points that you guys made, which were such great take homes for people to think about around what Mike was just saying. Perfection is the enemy of progress. So everything that we do will have an impact, but we just have to figure out how to look at the impacts so that we can make better decisions in the future. And then as we know better, we can do better. And for consumers, the best way with what you have available to reduce your impact on the environment is to buy, waste, and use less. And so whether that is a product that maybe standards would say is a dirty product, or whether that's an organic product, whatever product you like and will use the full product and not just throw away because it goes moldy, that would probably be a good solution. So don't feel bad about your purchasing decisions. If you're using this product that people are fear-mongering around, I mean, maybe just start to question the fear-mongering. Why are they fear-mongering? Is there a brand that they're trying to sell? Is that part of the fear-mongering? And then the final thing that I will say will be, we can never truly be sustainable. This is a moving target that we're constantly moving towards. if a company claims that they are a sustainable brand, that's something that bothers me because we're never going to be sustainable. Everything that we do has an impact. We can just try to be more sustainable. And that would be the messaging that I would prefer to see. Communication on how we're actually trying to reduce our impact, actually showing metrics for those reductions rather than looking at fallacies, which I find so often we are. And that's, I guess, my endpoint there. Thank you, everyone, for joining as the viewers. You guys had such great questions, and I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them into our panelists. You guys were excellent. You had such great points to leave our viewers to think about. Just so everyone knows, our next e-panel we're going to be announcing it in a few days, but it's going to be around accessibility in wellness, or the price of wellness is what it's going to be called. So stay tuned. I think the date, we're still just finalizing it, but I'm pretty sure the date is going to be December 5th. So stay tuned. I'm going to be announcing that on my Instagram probably first next week. If you have suggestions for a future panel, we do these every month, then leave them in the comments of this video and I'll definitely consider it for a future panel. And if you haven't watched our previous panels, we have had one a month since, actually more at the start of the pandemic, but then we kind of slowed down and stopped being I guess ludicrous with our time. We were doing two a month, which was too much. But go check out the other videos that we have on our YouTube. But thank you all, and thank you to our viewers, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.